deep inside, there's a huge part of me that's gone.
The horror is once you get out, trying to get back what you'd lost.
When you're on that side of the bars and there's no way, there's no hope, there's no crack, you give up.
Took away a big portion of my life, took away my life with my children.
I mean, what happened to the word investigation?
Helpless, fear, anger, and revenge, and wanting people to be held accountable for what had happened to me.
And why? Why did you do it? What possessed you to play God?
I knew my life was over right there.
Having my family taken away, everything taken away from me.
I had my life stolen away for 25.5 years for a crime I didn't commit. You can't get that time back.
Hi, I'm Kelly Fanson.
And I'm Kelly Lozon.
And this is Real Life Wrongs, where we dive into the stories, the crimes, and the hard times of the complicated world of wrongful convictions.
Episode 6. This is going to sting a little. Highlight case, Kyle Unger. Guests, Alison Craig and Wendy Gillis. And special guest, Alain Olivier.
We're really giving you a Mr. Big meal on this episode. Listen straight through or take in bite-sized stretches. Either way, we have 3 wrongful conviction stories. One is a full account from a wrongfully convicted individual, Alain Olivier, the inspiration for the Netflix movie Target Number 1. So please stay tuned for that. But first, Rose Isle, Manitoba, southwest Winnipeg, 1990. It's a Friday night in June. There's a summer music festival on the ski resort property in town, and at the last minute, you decide to go with your friend, John. Walking around the festival, there must be up to 1,000 kids from your school and surrounding areas. You see Brigitte Grenier, who you know from school and who you've sort of had a crush on, but she's not in your friend group, so you don't say hello. At school, you're not one of the popular kids, but tonight feels a little different. You're fitting in, you're a part of things, talking around bonfires, and at some point, you decide to ask Brigitte to dance, but she declines. She's been dancing most of the evening with a guy from a nearby town. Later that night, you go to the restrooms and return to the bonfire having acquired some LSD. You tell John that you saw Brigitte with some guy in the woods. Around 1:30 a.m., after having taken LSD, you decide to walk around to, quote, look for some tail. Sometime later, you return to the bonfire to find John and a few others still hanging around, so you join back in with them. With things winding down, you and John leave the festival together between 4:30 and 5 a.m. by hitching a ride in somebody's car. The next day, you learn that Brigitte Grenier's body has been discovered in a wooded area near the festival. The news reports are claiming that this is one of the most horrific murders in Manitoba's history. The town is distraught and looking for answers, and the RCMP will stop at nothing to solve it. They bring you in for questioning and decide that you're their prime suspect, but there's no evidence to support this hunch. Determined to prove they're right, they resort to an elaborate scheme to get you to confess. All you have to do is believe their lies, and you do. You buy it, hook, line, and sinker. This is the story of Kyle Unger, and although this could appear to be a case of simple misinformation, Kyle's story involves a little-known undercover police tactic known as Mr. Big. But first, the details of Brigitte Grenier's murder.
Like Kyle, school was out for Brigitte, and she was excited to go to the Woodstock Music Festival with a few friends, including her good friend Marlis. At some point in the evening, a boy from school, who she knew as Kyle, asked her to dance, but she wasn't interested because she was hitting it off so well with Timothy Houlihan, a 17-year-old from a nearby town. Around 1:30 in the morning, Brigitte and Timothy slip off into the woods somewhere on the huge property. A little later, her friend Marlis and another friend Barry are ready to call it a night. They go to find her to give her a ride, but she's not ready to leave. She tells them she'll find another way home. The next morning, Brigitte's nude body is found in a creek in a heavily wooded area next to the festival grounds. Now, I just want to forewarn our listeners, this part is graphic. Brigitte had been beaten so badly that she was unrecognizable. She'd been struck in the head many times. She had extensive bruising across her eyes and nose. Her lips were swollen. She had bite marks on her breast and arm, and she had large sticks that had been inserted forcefully into her vagina and her rectum. But with all of this trauma, it was determined that her cause of death was strangulation. Along the shore, detectives found her backpack and ID, her jeans, which were torn in two, her ripped underwear, bloody socks, t-shirt, and sweatshirt, and her shoes were tossed in opposite directions.
Two victims tied to the same incident, but in an entirely different manner. The first is the victim of a crime. The second is a victim of the system. Undercover stings are coercive and manipulative. They encompass a number of factors associated with wrongful convictions, like tunnel vision, informants, false confessions, and public pressure on the police. So, Kelly, let's unpack it all. What's a Mr. Big operation or a Mr. Big sting?
So the Mr. Big sting is an elaborate undercover technique used by the police to solve cold cases. Basically, the police are looking to build a case around one person who they believe is guilty of a serious crime.
Okay, got to admit, sounds pretty Hollywood cool. Can't wait for the doc on Netflix. The police take on roles and focus a whole operation on gathering what's necessary to prove their target is the criminal they're looking for.
Yeah, pretty much. And with Mr. Big, the proof they're looking for usually comes in the form of a confession.
Okay, now undercover policing is a standard practice for solving cases, right?
Yes, it is. But interestingly, in most countries, including the US, the UK, and France, Mr. Big confessions aren't allowed to be admitted as evidence in court. They say that that kind of policing is misaligned with the values of their justice system. So before we go any further, can we just let that sink in for a second? The US, the UK, and France don't allow these confessions because they contradict the values of the justice system. So what is that saying about the Canadian justice system?
Well, I mean, outside our borders, it's not even called Mr. Big. It's called the Canadian technique. So Canada's found a way to get around existing rules designed to protect the rights of the target of an undercover operation. Something to be proud of. Cue the anthem. But again, undercover policing is still standard stuff, right?
Sure. Undercover policing, as we tend to think of it, you know, where there's an officer who infiltrates a criminal organization, collects information, and then makes a bust or tries to break up current criminal activity like drug or human trafficking. You know, that kind of stuff is pretty common and accepted practice.
It seems like a justifiable and necessary production for taking these underground organizations down. But Mr. Big stings are different, aren't they? They're designed solely to solve a cold case.
Exactly. And because of that, it requires a completely different strategy because a crime's already been committed and there's nothing so far that has been useful in finding the perpetrator.
Yeah, and a completely different strategy can mean whatever gets the job done.
Yes, it can. So with a traditional undercover operation, you have one officer who goes undercover. And to do this, they're going to create a new persona for themselves, and that allows them to get in with the group that they're surveilling.
And with a Mr. Big sting, you have any number of officers who create what seems to be a criminal organization, a gang of some kind. So now it's not just one persona for one officer, but an entire cast.
Right. And once the fake crime ring is set up, The officers build a rapport with the target to ultimately lure him into becoming part of this fake criminal group. And they do that by involving them in some minor crimes, but then rewarding them with huge amounts of money and the illusion of power.
And the rewards also work to make the target feel like they're moving up the ranks within the organization. Sounds clever. So what's the problem?
Where do I begin? I mean, Mr. Big is problematic in so many ways, but mainly because they're set up to prove someone's guilt rather than working objectively to solve the case. It's the belief in the suspect's guilt that is the overriding factor that drives the investigation. And this is obviously going to lead to tunnel vision, and the tunnel vision will run rampant because the officers are so focused on one person and on one theory. And on top of this, another problem with Mr. Big is that they're coercive. Big time. I mean, they're jammed with coercive tactics aimed at getting the confession that's needed to close the case.
Right. The confession is the goal. So they essentially wine and dine you, befriend you, and reward you.
And often bully and scare the snot out of you along the way.
Yeah. And based on these high pressure coercion tactics, there's always a chance a confession could be false.
Yes. This is always a possibility with any confession, but when you throw in a healthy mix of threats and glamour, you have to wonder how true anything is that might come out of these people's mouths. And I think the important thing to remember is that even though Mr. Big stings don't always end up in a wrongful conviction, the convictions coming out of these cases should be looked at as questionable at best, because they ignore the safeguards that normally govern undercover operations.
Okay, so we've talked about how Canada gets around it. What are some of the rules that Mr. Big gets around?
So first, we have the confessions rule, which says that any statement made to a person in authority, so a cop, must be proven to be voluntary for it to be admissible.
Definition of voluntary would be useful here.
So voluntary means that you're not being coerced into giving the confession, that you're doing it of your own free will. And interestingly, the Canadian courts have decided that this rule doesn't apply to Mr. Big cases because the targets don't know that they're confessing to an officer. So, they don't know that they're confessing to a person in authority. Instead, the target thinks they're talking with their colleagues or their friends. And on top of this, the rule only applies to confessions made in police custody.
Right. So again, that there's the fine print, but also just in terms of voluntary, like, they're willingly just confessing, but because it's a ruse, that's where I'm, sort of like, how does voluntary work there? Like, of course it's voluntary. If they are lying about their confession because they want to receive these rewards and stuff, like, then all of a sudden you're really twisting voluntary, right?
Well, the courts are saying voluntary doesn't even apply.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't even matter. I mean, and really one of the things that should be, but never is, or seems to never be considered, is that, like you said, that they think they're with friends or colleagues. And so there's this reality of false bravado, right? Where I am going to make myself look like a bad dude so that I can continue to fit in with a group of bad dudes. Doesn't mean that what I'm saying is true. I mean, how many times have you told your friend, oh, I went out drinking and I, had way more drinks than was even remotely close to what you actually had, but you're doing it to make yourself look like, haha, I'm so awesome. Same thing in this case, only when we're talking about murder.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, again, they're thinking that, like, the courts are saying that none of this matters because so all these rules that we've put in place don't matter because the target is confessing to an officer who they don't know is an officer out in the field. Another rule that Mr. Big avoids is the one that deals with police trickery. Basically, police trickery, deception, it's allowed as a legitimate way of getting a confession as long as the trickery doesn't bring the administration of justice into disrepute or shock the conscience of the community.
All right. Am I wrong in thinking it takes a lot to shock a community these days? I mean, in the last 5 to 10 years, my shock may have dissolved into a state of just constant disappointment. If our tolerance towards behavior is constantly being challenged or shocked, then, I think over time we become immune to it, like by sensationalizing or even romanticizing criminal behaviors through our stories on, in film and TV. We might be more inclined to think in the case of a police sting that, it's cool that they're doing something elaborate and deceptive. And I guess that's all good until you're the target.
That's a really interesting point. And in Canada, over the years, it's been determined that Mr. Big doesn't bring the administration of justice into disrepute or shock the community.
And sometimes they do. So let's stay tuned for our special guest interview with Alain Olivier for more on that. But until we speak with Alain, let's give an example of a sting op where the court ruled that the officers did overstep.
So the case of Nelson Hart involved an underprivileged individual who had less than average IQ and a medical condition. So one day in the summer, he took his 2 daughters out swimming and he lost both his daughters in a tragic swimming accident. There was no evidence to suggest that the death of his daughters was anything but an accident. And the RCMP thought differently. 3 years after losing his 2 daughters, Nelson Hart was befriended by undercover officers who gave him more money than he had ever had, and arguably more importantly, friends, which he had never had. And after a few months of running with his new friends, he had to prove his worth to Mr. Big to stay in the gang. And the best way for him to do this was to confess to killing his 2 daughters.
In case you're not sure, Nelson's case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, where in 2014, they reviewed the admissibility of the confessions and the latitude given to undercover officers in Mr. Big stings. They decided that the targets of these stings did not have enough protection in place. So that sounds promising.
But wait, there's more. They didn't give any specific guidelines or rules for the police to follow. So what this decision says is that any confession given to the police through a Mr. Big sting is to be presumed inadmissible until the Crown can prove on a balance of probabilities, which is the lowest burden of proof in law, that its probative value outweighs its prejudicial effect.
So basically, somehow we're not going to tell you how a person should be protected from totally incriminating themselves. But if the findings are like super necessary to the case, it doesn't matter how much you bent the rules.
But the courts did add that any confession given as a result of a Mr. Big sting has to be looked at carefully for traditional markers of reliability. So things like whether it led to the discovery of additional evidence, or if it contains a level of detail that only the true perpetrator could know.
Okay, but you have to wonder if this actually changed anything. Let's compare the numbers from before the Hart decision and after. Between 1990 to 2008, so pre-Hart, we know of 350 Mr. Big cases. According to the RCMP, the majority of these cases ended in convictions. They boast a 75% confession rate and a 95% conviction rate when the confession was entered as evidence. Then between 2014 to 2019, so after Hart, we know of 61 cases where the Hart test was applied to determine the admissibility of the Mr. Big confession. In 51 of the cases, the confession was admitted. And when the confession was admitted, the accused was found guilty in 49 of the cases, so 96% of the time. So really the numbers are almost the same as what was going on before the Hart decision. So does that new rule really change anything?
Well, bottom line is the RCMP says it's really effective, and without it, a lot of cases wouldn't be solved.
And sounds like we can trust that the RCMP would never cross the line. Was that sarcasm?
I think this is where I'm gonna look away and just avoid making any kind of comment.
So, okay, what I've learned is the desire to close a case can sometimes result in a passionate approach from officials, and that desire can sometimes skew their perceptions. So it's human for one to become myopic and fail to see the forest for the trees, like to give an expert opinion of what the world of Mr. Big is all about. We had the chance to speak with Alison Craig. Alison is a founding partner of Posner Craig Stein. She's successfully conducted hundreds of trials at both the provincial and superior court levels.
I was so excited to speak with Alison. I mean, look at her resume. She is busy fighting the good fight, and she's a staunch advocate against wrongful convictions. She represented 9 wrongfully convicted victims at the inquiry that was called in to look at the flawed work of the now disgraced Dr. Charles Smith. But on top of that, she successfully defended Alan Smith against one of the worst Mr. Big operations in our country. So because of this, Mr. Big is an area that's near and dear to her heart. Amazon Prime actually just recently released a mini-series about Al Smith's case called The Unsolved Murder of Beverly Lynn Smith. Just as a quick recap and a preamble, hopefully it's not a spoiler, Beverly Smith was murdered in December 1974, and the case went cold, and it wasn't until 2004 when her neighbor, Alan Smith, became the focus of the investigation. Long story short, police were fixated on solving the case for Beverly's remaining family, so they came up with a Mr. Big sting like no other, to the point that they had Al believing that he was helping dispose of a body for Mr. Big. But enough from me. Let's hear from Alison.
It started in Canada, actually, and the traditional Mr. Big model is the police target a suspect who they believe is responsible, usually for a homicide that they're investigating, and they gradually envelop their suspect or their target into a criminal organization. That's the traditional Mr. Big. So there's Mr. Big, which is the head of the criminal organization. And then there's, various underlings. And there's the target. And gradually they get the target involved in their criminal organization. And ultimately, the traditional storyline is they all end up in a hotel room together, and they tell the target that they want them to be a member of the criminal organization. But to do so, you have to confess to usually a homicide or something very serious. And that way that, the criminal organization knows that their secrets are safe with the person they're bringing in. And that's kind of the Coles Notes version of it. This person that they target is already the suspect in a particular homicide that they're investigating. They've run out of leads. And so Mr. Big operation is the way they go. And usually they somehow will reference that particular homicide throughout the course of the Mr. Big operation. So, the target knows, bingo, that's the one I should tell them about when ultimately it gets to this confession stage. The most horrendous example of it is a gentleman named Al Smith. And he was the suspect in a murder from 1974. It's almost always cold cases to some degree that Mr. Bigs are used in. So he was a suspect in a murder from the 70s. And by this time, it was the late 2000s. They had reopened the investigation several times, always hit a dead end. And so they decide that, well, actually, let me back up a step because this makes it even worse. By this time, he's a lonely old man living in his daughter's basement. He's got no money. He's got no friends. He's got nothing. And the police get a hold with a warrant of his psych records from, he's been in and out of the psychiatric system for a long time. And the thing they pick up on is he at one point had told the psychiatrist that his one dream in life was to own his own ice fishing hut. The only thing he liked in life was ice fishing. So lo and behold, he's walking through the mall one day in his town, and there's a booth for a contest to win a fishing trip. And so he enters, ultimately wins. The whole thing is, of course, fake. It's all police officers. So he wins this trip, and off he goes with all these other winners of the fake contest, all of whom are undercover police officers. And that's how it starts. And then this one went on for almost a year. And he had interactions with the various officers and the characters on a daily basis, almost. But gradually, the way Mr. Biggs worked, and they did it incredibly effectively, sadly, in this one, is they take the things that they know are missing from the target's life, and they provide those. So it's inducement after inducement after inducement. So in this case, Mr. Smith, he didn't have any friends, he didn't have any money, and he didn't have anybody to go fishing with. So those are the three things they gave him. He became best friends with one of the police officers in particular, to the point that over the course of this operation, they're telling each other how much they love each other. And Al is saying, you know, it has a dream come true. I've never had such a good buddy before, and all sorts of things.
Oscar worthy.
It's sad. It's really sad. And the undercover officer, you know, weaves his way into Al's family and buys gifts for his grandchildren that Al can't afford to buy, and the whole nine yards. Gradually, Mr. Big is introduced, who's kind of the boss of Fishing Buddy. And they start getting him to do, you know, little, he'll be a watch for a drug deal that they're involved in, or, you know, he'll be a lookout when they're about to go do a robbery, and he'll get paid $50 or $100 or whatever. And that's a lot of money to Al. So now we've got the friends, we've got the fishing buddy, we've got the money, and on and on and on it goes. And the way, and I should say that this entire time, I think about the first 6 months of the operation, Al is talking about how he was once wrongfully accused of a homicide, which he had been, the one they were investigating, and how he wanted to sue the police. He's talking about this constantly. So ultimately, to make a long story short, one night, Fishing Buddy wakes up Al in the middle of the night and says, Mr. Big needs help. We got to go help. We got to go help. So off they go to some industrial area. They come across Mr. Big standing there with a shotgun in his hand. There's a dead guy on the floor, which is actually a mannequin wrapped in a tarp and pig's blood and all sorts of things. And he says, I just killed this guy. And he orders Al and Fishing Buddy to dump the body and burn all the evidence and on and on and on. So they do all those things. Then they end up at Mr. Big's cottage the next day. And essentially Mr. Big says, look, you guys know I just killed somebody. You both have to tell me something equally bad that you have done, basically, or I'm going to have to kill you. I mean, I'm barely paraphrasing when I say that. So out comes a nonsense confession. And it was demonstrably false in every imaginable way with respect to the evidence, as the police actually knew it. So they continue on for another 6 months. Mr. Big pretends to hire private investigators. On and on and on it goes. Al gives various versions of confessions, none of which match the evidence. And ultimately they said, to heck with it. And they arrested him. And he sat in jail for 4 years until ultimately he was acquitted. So that's kind of there's a lot more going on, but that's the short version of it. They knew that the deceased's husband had, I think it was about 8 grams or 8 ounces, some small amount of marijuana in the house at the time of the homicide, and it was missing. And one of the things that they got Al involved in during the Mr. Big operation was this fake robbery where they go and rob a pretend drug dealer of 40 pounds of marijuana. So lo and behold, during the course of this confession that Al gives to the homicide, several versions of it, he says that he stole 40 pounds of marijuana out of the house of the deceased. And that was the motive. I mean, he gives various different motives, but that was one of the motives he gives in one of his confessions. The 40 pounds of marijuana was not what had actually happened, and very clearly came from the scenario that they themselves had him wrapped up in. So that's just one example of many of the things that he said that obviously were not true.
Well, and his fishing buddy asked, when he said 40 pounds, his fishing buddy had said, you know, like, are you sure it was 40 pounds? Because that would take 10 garbage bags.
Yes, exactly.
And his response was, oh, you'd be surprised 40 pounds can fit in one bag.
One bag.
Right?
Carry it in one garbage bag.
There's just so much discrepancy between fact and what he has come to believe. Because I think what's really important to keep in mind with Mr. Big is that there's just this continuous blurring of lines between fact and fiction, reality and fantasy, right? To the point that the target is not supposed to even know what world they're living in, right? Like that they can't separate what is true and not true. And I think this case in this scenario just gives such a clear example of how blurred the lines were for him.
Absolutely. And to the point that once he was arrested and charged, for the first 6 months at least that he was making court appearances, the officer who played his best friend, the fishing buddy, was in court. And even then, when Al saw him there with his badge and his uniform and everything else, he could not grasp that he was a police officer. Like his counsel at the time would say, you know, there's Mr. X, your fishing buddy, and, you know, he's in a police uniform, he's here to testify. And Al would say, no, that's just impossible. The things we did, that's impossible. He cannot possibly be a police officer. And he's standing right there in front of him in a courtroom in a uniform, but he could not grasp the distinction. He has basically cut himself off from the world. He cannot be near people, be around people, have relationships. He's just, I mean, his life is destroyed. It was bad before. It's far worse now.
And so here's what I don't understand. Sorry, Cal. When they say nobody confesses to a crime they didn't commit, I have a real cognitive dissonance there because everything they're doing is to coerce a confession.
You know, if these are admitted into evidence, regardless of what we're all showing them and saying, the vast majority of people will still say to themselves, yeah, but he confessed to a murder. If you were innocent, you would never do that. And that's why false confessions are one of the leading causes of wrongful convictions, because people just can't understand why anyone would ever do that.
Yeah. And we spoke to some experts about false confessions. And this is exactly it. That conventional wisdom states you would never confess to something you didn't do, especially to something so serious. Like, okay, yeah. I confess I stole your pen, you know, when I didn't, but I would never say that I murdered somebody and try to give details of this account, right? And it's interesting because Mr. Big says, you know, we get a confession 75% of the time. And when we get a confession and admit it in court, it ends with a 95% conviction rate. So juries are quite keen to accept these Mr. Big confessions, which I find shocking. So you obviously know what goes into behind the scenes far more than the average jury member. what can we tell jury members? Like, do we take these confessions at face value, or should we be considering, hey, it's a Mr. Big confession, so there's probably some sketchiness involved?
I think if we're going to continue to allow them to be admitted, there have to be very special instructions given to a jury about all of the psychology that goes into them, about the psychology behind inducements, all that sort of stuff. It's very different when it comes from the trial judge than from, defense counsel who's just there trying to get his client off. So there does have to be a very specific and lengthy instruction about the dangers of this, which there's not at the moment, but there needs to be. They talk about what an effective tool it is for the police and how they don't want to get rid of that entirely and deprive the police of such an effective tool. But it's also a very effective tool for wrongful convictions. And that's the problem. And that's why, there's plenty of other policing methods that, can be used. And if you have to rely on a confession that is the result of inducements, whether they come from a uniformed police officer, which is not allowed, or not, what is the difference psychologically? And nobody has ever been able to answer that. Like from the perspective of the person who's making the confession, obviously not consciously seeing it this way, but the inducements are the inducements, whether they're from a man in uniform or your buddy. So I've never been able to understand the distinction when it comes to specific undercover operations like this. The police in this case were obviously, they were living their best lives. Like all they did all day was go fishing, get drunk, go to strip clubs. Those are like the main components of almost any, I guarantee any Mr. Big operation you look into will involve several strip club attendances. Every single one I've ever done.
Paid vacation.
They're having a grand old time. Every fishing trip that these guys took, Al would usually smoke a bunch of marijuana. The officer would drink beer, the amount of which was controversial at trial, but at least admitted to drinking some. And they were obviously having a great time. Although I will say, on that note, one of the things that happened in this operation was the night between the fake body dump, which is a phrase that should never exist. But anyway, the night between the fake body dump and the forced confession the next day, the officers get together and they have their debriefing, as they always do, after every scenario. But someone forgot to turn their body pack off this time while they were having their debriefing. And
so sorry, this is when Al is not present. Like it's just right. The officers.
Yeah.
Right.
So Al's at Mr. Big's cottage at this point, and all the officers are at some nearby cottage they've all rented as a base, having their nightly meeting. And someone forgets to turn off their body pack. And the whole drive, it was several hours long from when they dumped the body to getting to the cottage. Al is talking about how he's scared out of his mind. He thinks Mr. Big is going to kill them. You can hear it in his voice. He can barely get words out. And so they're at this debriefing and they start making jokes about the fact that because of what they had just done to him, Al was probably back at the cottage committing suicide. And they start making sound effects of his feet hitting off the various walls, from having hung himself. And they laugh about that for a while. So, it was one of the most disturbing things I've ever heard. And then they went on to start planning how they were going to lie to the judge about it. Because clearly, if they knew that he was in fear at the time of his confession, that would be a bit of a problem come court time. So they started, I forget the exact phrase, but it was something to the effect of, well, we're not Kreskin's children, Your Honor. We didn't know what he was thinking. And this was all on tape, planning how to lie to the judge about it. And lo and behold, at the preliminary hearing, before this accidental recording was ever disclosed to the defense lawyers, they came and testified to exactly that. We didn't know what he was thinking. We didn't know he was scared. And then ultimately on the eve of trial, we finally got a hold of this recording where they're on tape planning how to lie about it. So that's what they're always going to say when they come to court. He was fine. He was having a great old time. He wasn't scared at all. And usually nothing could be further from the truth. Hart addresses the very specific fact scenario that I mentioned earlier, which is basically gangsters in a hotel room. Those are the characters, and that's how it proceeds. So now what they're doing is changing all the characters around. So for example, I had one post-Hart where it wasn't a gang. The characters were, the main undercover was a financial analyst, and he hired the target, our client, to be his driver. And all the same inducements ultimately end up happening. He gets paid for his time. He has a new best friend. There's a little, naughty criminal activity on the side. All of those things are still present, but it wasn't gangsters in a hotel room. And so ultimately the judge said, Hart doesn't apply. This isn't a Mr. Big. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. And the confession was admitted. And that's what's happening now is tweak the characters a little bit. Everything else stays the same. Hart doesn't apply.
When admitting a Mr. Big case, the standard the courts use is so long as it doesn't shock the community conscience, or they use the community conscience standard. So however you want to word that, but it's basically as long as it doesn't shock the community conscience.
What's going to shock the community conscience these days?
But every time I read a Mr. Big sting and everything that's gone into it, and like in Al Smith's case, that they took his medical records, unsealed them when they were directed not to, and then used that against him.
That's shocking.
Right? Like,
yeah.
To me, that shocks my conscience, and I'm part of the community, and I'm exposed to this stuff a lot more than the average citizen. So if I'm shocked, I can only imagine that my neighbors are also shocked. And yet the courts go, yeah, you're fine. That doesn't really shock anybody, I don't think.
No, right. I have no idea what that phrase means, honestly, because anybody I've ever told any of these stories to has been shocked. So I don't know what it means, but it's certainly a very out of touch standard, whatever it is.
Like, I just wonder whose conscience they're talking about, because to me, it's clearly not the community. And, I wonder if the legal community's conscience is different than the, community center conscience.
There's a reason that Mr. Big operations in particular are not allowed in the United States. Like, let's just stop there. If something's not allowed in the United States, it's clearly a problem. And there is so much research into the causes of wrongful convictions and false confessions. And when you look at that research, you will really come to understand just how powerful to anybody the inducements and the fear that are involved in these operations are. So you have to look beyond the end result and put yourselves in the shoes, for example, of somebody who you just watched basically commit a homicide. You saw the body, you saw the blood, you saw the gun, and the very next day that person is saying to you, if you don't confess to a murder, you're going to be next. I mean, when you think of it that way, you come to understand just how vulnerable I think any of us would be to saying what you have to say to get out of that situation and get home to your family.
We also spoke with Wendy Gillis, an award-winning crime and police reporter from the Toronto Star. She's covered some pretty heavy topics, including the investigation into Alan Smith.
And Wendy was able to give us a whole different perspective of Mr. Big operations. I mean, how cool is it that she covered the same case that Alison defended against?
Yeah, so here are our highlights with Wendy.
So I cover crime and policing for the Toronto Star, and I've been doing that for about 7 years now. And I was introduced to Mr. Big's kind of early in sort of learning about the justice system and in particular taking an interest in policing. So that's kind of where my interests have taken me in terms of how I have covered the criminal justice system. And so I started, following cases that involved interesting police tactics, and by virtue of kind of writing about it, started getting more tips. And so early, I think in 2013 or 2014, I was alerted to a case out in Oshawa that involved a murder, a cold case, as Mr. Biggs often do, where the accused, Al Smith, was on trial, and the Durham police in that case had used a Mr. Biggs sting. And so I remember hearing, police officers had used a fake corpse and there was like sheep's blood. And I was like, there's no way that is true, but I will check this out. And I did check it out. And that was in fact what they had done in that case. And so that case was sort of unfolding right at the same time as the Supreme Court in the R.V. Hart case was sort of coming to the fore. And so we were starting to have conversations about, what are Mr. Big stings? How should they be used? Should they be used? What checks should be placed on them? That kind of thing. So it was really interesting to be literally covering a Mr. Big case while this was a conversation that was happening kind of in the highest courts in our country. So I followed that case. I was in the courtroom kind of when Justice Class, the judge, tossed out the confession, said that there were, there was a hole that a Mack truck could drive through, which has become sort of a well-known quote, and has since kind of followed that through. And so I would say that case really introduced me to all of the different elements of Mr. Big investigations. I hadn't known that we in Canada would be using a tactic that would involve that level of sort of fictitious aspect. And so now that I know that this is employed, I certainly think we need to be extremely cautious about what we allow police officers to do sort of on behalf of the state, and what we're willing to allow to garner evidence, even if that evidence is good. And we can talk about, I'm sure we'll get into whether or not we can rely on the evidence that these types of tactics, bring to the surface. But I think we have to be really, really vigilant, because it does involve this tactic does involve quite a bit of like drama, kind of, right? I mean, the whole thing is made up. We have undercover officers who are posing, who are playing a role, right? And there's theater involved for weeks or months at a time, and so I do think that is surprising, probably, to the average member of the public. I sort of covered this Al Smith case, kind of like did a few sort of daily stories here and there, did a bit of a more detailed look at what went wrong after getting some of the transcripts from the sting, and then ended up doing quite a large feature. And from that feature, it was kind of interesting because it came out around the same time as the serial podcast. You guys know what I'm talking about. And that was the Anon Syed case. And there were so many. It was interesting to talk about that case because people were like, oh, did he do it? Did he not do it? That was kind of one of our introductions into true crime and, having conversations about guilt or innocence. And my piece about Al Smith came out around the same time. And I was so interested to get the feedback where people would say, oh, like, great job showing that he is innocent, or great job, showing this injustice and exposing, that a guilty man walked free. And I think that really speaks to the confusion that can come about from these types of stings, where, you hear someone say they did something, that is really powerful. And that can really stick in someone's mind in terms of saying, well, why would they say they did it when they didn't do it? And so I think that's where, journalists, for example, when in covering these kinds of cases, need to explain the circumstances under which people might give a people confession. And then I know, we might get into this as well. Judges need to be instructing juries about why, people might confess to something that they didn't do. And so, but I do think it comes back to the power of hearing someone say, I did it. And my piece, the bigger feature story that I did on the Al Smith case, I actually started the story with some of his words from his confession, just to show kind of, they were played in court. The victim's daughter was in the courtroom and she heard, him confessing. And that is hard to forget, I think. And I think that's another aspect of this too, is the impact that these stings have on victims, and what it can do to them to hear a confession and then have a case tossed out. I think again there, and I'm sure that we'll talk about this a little bit. I think that there is a lot of controversy over this because it does garner evidence that is useful sometimes, right? I mean, I think we saw the Supreme Court not completely close off this police tactic because it was deemed to have some merit, right? And so I think that you'll find members of the public that say, okay, well, yeah, why would we infringe upon investigators' abilities to do their work or to investigate what are often really challenging cases, right? I mean, we don't see Mr. Big stings employed in recent homicide investigations, for example. Usually it's cold cases, cases where there's no DNA evidence, missing persons cases. And so lots of times we have officers who have done kind of everything else, right? And so I think from the perspective of a member of the public, I would say, they might feel, well, let's let the police do their jobs. And, yes, it's probably a little unconventional, but, we want to see what comes from this. It'll be interesting to see kind of how often it's employed now that, it isn't kind of the Wild West, right? I mean, I feel like because the public didn't know it was happening, it was used with a lot less scrutiny. And now the courts are paying a lot more attention to the circumstances under which, these types of stings are employed. Often the confessions come about when that person might feel afraid, might feel pressured by virtue of all of the, the perks of being the target of the investigation, having new friends, having money, and wanting to stay in that position, right? So either because they want to be part of the group or prove their loyalty to the group, or they may actually be afraid, which was a real question in the Alan Smith case. Was, is this someone who was afraid? And so
he was willing to jump out of a moving vehicle down the highway to get away from Mr. Big because he was afraid he was going to kill him. So I'm going to venture a guess that he was afraid.
Yeah. I mean, and you, even just from the circumstances, I think you need to just sort of ask yourself honestly, this is someone who thought he was consorting with people who had just killed someone and then, were trying to hide the body. So that would make me afraid. So I think that has to be something that's kept in the mind of the average member of the public. It's hard to picture yourself in a position where you confess to murder, but I think if you spend a little time thinking about it, it's like, okay, well, you can understand how wrongful convictions and false confessions can be a product of this sting.
Aren't these tactics just by definition entrapment?
Well, that's a great question. I think I would go back to you guys on that, because it feels like that's more of like a legal question. Again, we have the permission in Canada. Essentially, this tactic has been condoned by our highest court. And so I suppose the answer would be no, because the tactics are allowed. There's just these sort of checks that have been placed on them now. But I think that's up for debate outside of Canada. We have a lot of places that have said, actually, we're not willing to even entertain the possibility of running this sting, so we're just not going to allow it. And that in itself, I think, says something about kind of, we aren't willing, in lots of places. Ultimately, this is about, what are you willing to do to get evidence? If this is something that we are going to be, we as Canadian society are going to be accepting, and that police officers and investigators are able to run, then I do think there needs to be further analysis of its worth. And, that can be journalistic, that can be academic, but we should gather a bit more data. And kind of in Canada, we're bad at doing that kind of stuff. So it'd be nice to sort of like, no, this sting has been run this many times. It has produced this many times, because as you point out, they are expensive. From a resources perspective, from a tax money perspective, it's hard. It can be sometimes hard to get a handle on how much policing, costs in terms of when it comes down to the granular sort of specific probes that they run. Like, how much does this investigation cost is a question I ask a lot and don't often get the answers to that. So we should be kind of making a cost benefit analysis. We need to be really carefully scrutinizing those confessions. And that's why, now there is that higher test to examine sort of, is this something that the courts are comfortable admitting? When you read about some of the defenses for this tactic, officers will often say, it's not like we picked someone out of the blue, right? Usually there is some reason why this person becomes the target of these kinds of investigations. And there again, we need to be extremely cautious about already sort of the tendency to have tunnel vision and have those blinders on. But I would feel better knowing, if something comes to trial, understanding kind of what the steps were leading up to identifying this person as a target. Was there already really good intelligence on this person? Was there, already something linking them to the crime that we don't know about? That kind of thing. And having that be pretty strong. It's not just the courts and judges that need to scrutinize police conduct, for example, but we all need to be, we all need to understand how the system works to be able to ask smart questions about it and raise concerns where there are some. So I think, opening up the court system to the public a bit more. We've had like such an interesting, 18-month-long experiment now on sending courts online, and whether that's on Zoom or in a few cases we've had judgments broadcast, right? I covered a case last summer where the judgment was live on YouTube. And I think that is so exciting and such a good thing for just sort of public understanding of the system. But unfortunately, it still remains challenging to get access to, exhibits in former cases or transcripts. It can be challenging to even confirm certain aspects of, someone's record. So digitizing, making it easier to get access to court documents, that's one thing that I would change in a big way. Hearing is not always believing is maybe what I would say. I think it's understandably really hard to wrap your head around, why would someone say that they did something when they didn't? And I think, if anyone listening to this podcast can come away with a little bit more of a, maybe I'll be a bit more critical of like hearing someone's confession in the future, then I think that would be a good takeaway, is that you can't always trust that someone says, that what someone says is true, especially when it comes to these kinds of stings, and understanding that a lot of wrongful convictions can be brought back to false confessions. And so we need to pay attention to that.
Coming up soon is our interview with Alain Olivier. But first, let's get a quick look back at Kyle's case, this time from the investigator's point of view.
So it's a highly attended music festival, and the police interview as many people as possible. When they interview Kyle, he really doesn't have much to contribute. They also interview Timothy Houlihan, and they note he has a number of visible scratches on his face and hands. But his interview doesn't go far because at age 17, he's a minor and his parents aren't there. So 2 days later, Timothy is interviewed again with his parents present.
And he tells the police he had sex with Brigitte that evening. And afterwards, when he was alone at the festival, a man attacked him. The police ask him for a description of his attacker, and he gives a description that's similar to Kyle Unger. The police ask Timothy if he knows Kyle. He says yes. They ask him for a description of Kyle, but it's completely different. Not at all a match. So, does something smell off to you?
Sure does. And a few days later, a blood test comes back and it confirms that the blood found on Timothy's shoe is a match to Brigitte's, and he's arrested.
There it is.
And at the time, Timothy is asked to provide a bite mark test.
Another flawed forensic, but, we chew on that in our forensics episode, so check that out.
So Timothy refuses to give a sample, but in an attempt to explain the blood on his shoes, he tells the police that he does actually know what happened that night.
Yeah, it's a memory triggering miracle. So Timothy tells them that Kyle came up on him and Brigitte having sex. Kyle was jealous. He flew into a rage and punched Brigitte. Tim says he tried to stop him, but Kyle strangled and beat Brigitte and then made Tim punch her. Tim says he did, but only because he was afraid of Kyle and feared for his life. And he says he only punched her twice. Despite the fact that this story was wildly different than anything else he'd told the police previously, they take Tim's statement at face value. In this version, Tim also described how he helped Kyle move the body.
And what's interesting, and probably should have raised more red flags than it did, is that throughout this version of events, Timothy matched crime scene details that were never released to the public.
And instead of questioning Timothy's statement further, both Kyle and Timothy are charged with first-degree murder. So Kyle is extremely cooperative with the police, including consenting to a bite mark test, which doesn't match the bites on Brigitte's body. But because Kyle was 19, he was held in custody. Being a small town,
It didn't take long for everyone to become aware that they had someone in custody for the murder. And to make things worse, Kyle was known as a troublemaker with a bit of a temper, so it didn't take much for the whole community to hate him. Meanwhile, because Tim was 17 and protected under the Young Offenders Act, he was released and sent home to await trial. No one even knew he was a suspect or tied to the crime in any way.
And Kyle's charge proceeds to a preliminary hearing. And on December 11th, 1990, the preliminary hearing ended in a stay of proceedings because the Crown had serious doubts about Kyle's involvement. The only physical evidence that they had against him was a hair sample. And the sample consisted of one single hair. And it came back as most likely Kyle's. There's no confession. There's no witness statements against or about Kyle, except for what Timothy said. So compare that to the forensic evidence they had against Timothy, which was staggering. Blood found on his running shoes was consistent with Brigitte's. A hair found on her pants was consistent with his. And the pubic hair found on Brigitte's sock was also consistent with Timothy.
Sometimes I have to be careful when shaking my head not to get whiplash.
Seriously, totally agree. So at that time, when the stay comes in, Kyle takes it as good news because he knows the Crown doesn't think they can make a case against him. And, Kyle thinks this is it. The end, he can put the whole ordeal behind him and move on. But what he doesn't know is that the RCMP still believe he's guilty. And they're setting out on a mission to prove it.
So based on what? What do they have that makes them so sure he's still their guy?
Based on that one hair.
The one that's most likely Kyle's.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, slam dunk. Case closed.
Right? So thinking that Kyle may have said something while in custody before or after his preliminary hearing, the RCMP interview over 20 inmates to find someone who'd testify against him in order to build a case. And 5 said they'd testify.
See, I can only imagine that this was to get some kind of benefit in exchange for their testimony, which you can check out in our Jailhouse Informants episode for more on how all of that, how those deals work.
So the Crown looked into these 5 upstanding citizens and only found one of them to be reliable enough to bring to trial. But when on the stand, Kyle's lawyer was able to immediately prove that he was lying. So again, you would think that all of this would make the case for Kyle's innocence even more clear.
Right, you would like to think that, but despite all of these setbacks, the police were still set on getting a conviction for Kyle, and they're running out of options. So in June 1991, they set up Operation Drifter into motion, beginning with the staging of a car breaking down in front of Kyle's house. So again, hook, line, and sinker, Kyle sees the car and goes out to help. Of course, he has no idea they're undercover officers. One of the officers thank Kyle for his help and offer to repay him for his time. He tells Kyle about an opportunity where he could get involved with their organization to make some money. Being young and in desperate need of money, and potentially looking for friends, which Kyle didn't have a lot of, he agrees.
And so over the course of about a week, Kyle does some odd jobs with his new friends. And during this time, he tells them 4 times that he had been wrongfully imprisoned. And at no point during these conversations did they ask for clarification or further details about what Kyle was talking about. And a week after this, Kyle is introduced to Mr. Big himself, who, of course, is another undercover officer.
And he's led to believe that this meeting is a job interview. And if the money is anything like the money he's been earning with his new friends, which is more than he's ever had, he wants this job. The thought of having a permanent position within this organization is actually too good to be true.
So during the meeting, Mr. Big emphasizes to Kyle that because the group was involved in illegal activities, which Kyle assumes to be drugs, he has to be trustworthy. They weren't interested in hiring someone who had ongoing problems with the police. Initially, Kyle tells them he didn't have any legal problems because, well, he didn't. But Mr. Big wasn't happy with this answer, and he kept pressing Kyle for information. Kyle was repeatedly reminded of the money and the friends that he had acquired through this network, and he kept being reminded of how easily that could all disappear. So, weighing his options, Kyle did what he thought would guarantee him a full-time job and what would make a good impression on his new boss. So, he gives an enthusiastic confession to Brigitte Grenier's murder.
2 days after this job interview, Mr. Big brings Kyle to the scene of the murder. Kyle repeatedly contradicts himself about the details of the crime, but Mr. Big is unfazed by these errors and keeps insisting that Kyle confess. So, under mounting pressure and afraid to lose the money, power, and new friends, Kyle maintains his guilt and confesses again.
And a few days after this, in June of 1991, Kyle is arrested again for Brigitte's murder, and he's brought to trial. But this time, they have his confession to present as evidence against him.
So in February 1992, a jury found Kyle and Timothy guilty of first-degree murder. Kyle was stunned by the verdict and later recalled his first thought was, how do I tell my parents? Remember, he's still just probably 20, 22 at the time.
Yeah.
And both Kyle and Timothy appeal. Kyle's appeal is denied. Timothy's is allowed. But Timothy's appeal was never heard because he committed suicide while on bail awaiting his new trial.
During this time, Kyle filed an application to appeal to the Supreme Court, but the application was denied. And so he sat in prison as a convicted murderer for the next 11 years before there would be any new developments in his case.
Yeah, I mean, I guess age isn't a factor for the RCMP if they are out to coerce a confession.
Yeah, I mean, it seems pretty excessive to have to resort to this kind of tactic to make an arrest of a young person. To most of us, when you stand back and look at a Mr. Big sting, I think we might quickly realize that the whole thing, the whole scenario that a target finds themselves in, the money, the friends, the power, it all fits under the category of too good to be true. But the reality is they do work and they are successful in getting confessions and closing a case.
And the reason they work is because they target vulnerable people who lack maturity, self-confidence, experience in the world, individuals under extreme stress, financially and emotionally, people in extreme positions of need.
Yeah. I mean, I said it earlier, there are so many problems with Mr. Big stings, and the vulnerability of the targets is just one. I mean, Kyle's youth and vulnerability are so clear when his first thought is, how do I tell my parents?
Right. So where is Kyle now?
Well, in the spring of 2004, Innocence Canada had a big win with the James Driscoll case. And in that case, hair microscopy evidence was called into question, and it was no longer accepted as incontrovertible proof of guilt. And so based on that, the government of Manitoba set up a review committee to determine if there were other cases like Driscoll's. So remember that one single strand of hair that was the physical evidence against Kyle?
Right, the most likely one.
Yeah, that one. So because of that one hair, it was decided that Kyle's conviction fell within the committee's mandate, and the hair was sent for DNA testing. The results came back and proved that the hair did not belong to Kyle. So this meant that the only piece of forensic evidence that had been used to link Kyle to the murder and to set Operation Drifter into motion was now scientifically proven to be wrong. So following that, Innocence Canada filed a 696 application to the Minister of Justice to ask that Kyle's conviction be quashed and a new trial ordered. And after reviewing the file, the minister ordered a new trial, and 4 years later, Kyle's name was finally cleared when the Attorney General's office withdrew the charges against Kyle and officially asked that he be acquitted.
So Kyle was cleared of the murder, but there wouldn't be a public inquiry into his wrongful conviction, and he wouldn't be offered any compensation because he had confessed. Now, the only thing left for him to do was to launch a civil suit against the RCMP and the prosecutors in his case, which meant that his legal battles weren't over.
So Kyle sued for compensation in 2011, and after a long and hard fight for compensation, his case was finally settled out of court in 2019 for a confidential amount. The last I heard, Kyle was living in British Columbia, but he moves around a lot. And he says it's because he has a hard time signing a lease that would keep him anywhere longer than a year because he wants to be able to move when he wants, which is something that he was deprived of for so long.
Yes, and incredibly, he refuses to see himself as a victim and believes the RCMP were just doing their job and that they got overzealous in doing it. Today, he says he finds himself reflecting on how one small decision, like attending a music festival, can impact the rest of your life. It's time to hear from Alain Olivier, a man who was the target of a Mr. Big operation, who spent 8 years in a Thai prison because of a Mr. Big sting. His story was the inspiration for the Netflix movie Target Number One.
I've known Alain for a long time, and I consider him to be a good friend. And I've probably heard more details about his case than most have. The fact that this man is still alive and still fighting to clear his name all these years later speaks directly to the tenacity of character that he has. He's always willing to share his story because he knows all too well how easy it is to get caught up in a Mr. Big sting. And he thinks that we all have a right to know where our tax dollars are going.
Alain has a lot to say. And as always, we bring you the highlights. In many cases, there are so many poignant parts to a story and the individual's point of view that sometimes it feels like it's all highlight. So grab a coffee or something stronger. Here's our chat with Alain.
The listeners are not familiar with your case because so much has gone missing from the web. There used to be, able to Google Alain Olivier and you would come up with the W5 documentary, or you would come up with news articles and whatnot. And now, thankfully, we have your website, alainolivier.ca. But beyond that, there's not much. And, you're told that once it's on the web forever. But when you have a powerful organization who can sanitize the web, now we can't find anything about your case. So let's back up and clarify for the listeners what happened in your case. Because, the very bare bones of it is your case started with a fake murder in British Columbia, and then it ended with the real death of an RCMP officer in another country that's like 11,000 kilometers away. So,
in fact, it's 12,000 miles exactly from Montreal.
Okay, fair enough. But from BC, from where the original, where everything started. Yeah. So if you can just very high level walk us through your involvement, or how you got involved when you knew you were a target? And basically what happened at the start?
Actually, it all started back in 1987. I was living in Gibson's Landing at the time, and I had just come back from Nepal, where in Southeastern Asia, where I had been traveling for about 3 months, and I became addicted to heroin. And when I came back to Gibson's Landing, I was introduced to a French-Canadian guy by the name of Glenn Barry, which happens to be an RCMP civil agent. It's a step higher than informant. And that guy was used by the RCMP to do their bidding and all their dirty work. And when I met him, I had a few grams of brown sugar from Nepal that I had taken back to cut my intake, my daily intake of drugs, everything. And I just wanted to cut it down until minimal amounts so the cold turkey wouldn't be too bad, or the withdrawal, like they call it. And I started going out fishing with that guy, and he did some heroin with me and everything. And after a couple of weeks, I ran out of drugs, and I got sick. And after that, I went back to work up in BC, up the mountain. I was tree planting until I got an accident that forced me to move back to Gibson's Landing. And at that point, that guy proposed me to become his associate in a small business that we had, a small salmon fishing company that was called Gibson's Charter.
And can I ask, was that the moment that you became the target? Or, because I have just seen the movie, and in the movie you met him on his fishing boat. Is that what happened?
Inspired from the story, actually. I met him at the pub, and I started going out on his boat on several occasions after that. And that guy, unbeknown to me,
Glenn Barry
went up to tell the RCMP that I control all the heroin market on the West Coast.
So what, in just chronologically, when did he approach them? So you met him at a pub, you went out on his boat with him, and then you went...
I met him February 7th. He told the RCMP was from the document April 2nd or April 1st, 87, that he had fallen on a big fish, me. That guy was
just a few months later.
Yeah, that guy was a master fisherman, died always. So he went on to tell the RCMP I was a major heroin importer, and he managed to get them to believe that it was true. And when Glenn Barry gave them my birth date, a criminal record came out with 11 convictions for drugs and weapons and stuff, violence and stuff like that. But that criminal record didn't belong to me. It belonged to another guy named Olivier, who had the same birth date that I had.
I wanted to ask about that, and I do want you to continue with, chronologically to go through the story. But who was that other person? What happened to him? Did he ever enter the story?
But no, he never did. He never did enter the story, and for a few reasons, like I told also some reporters in the past who wanted to stick on the identity of that person, especially. There are matters much more important than the identity of that person.
So this was just an individual who had prior convictions.
Mistaken me for him.
Right. And so that was one of the main reasons why they continued to with you as the target, was because of a misunderstanding of who they were dealing with.
And by May 1987, Glenn Barry informed me that he was leaving Gibson's for a whole month, and he left me alone to take care of Gibson's Charter with the secretary and another guy that had been hired to take people out. And he left for a month, and he came back, and he advised me that him and his friends in Vancouver had taken back an old container of cocaine from Colombia. And he even showed me a picture of him and a Colombian guy, like we saw in the movie with Jim Gaffigan by the pool. But Glenn Barry showed me the picture with him and a Colombian guy, but he was for sure Latino. I don't know where they were, but he was telling me that they were in Colombia.
And that guy, just for interest's sake, with, because people will hopefully watch this movie, was that guy just a pool boy? Was he just somebody?
He could have been anything. He could have been a delivery boy at the store. I mean, could have been anyone.
Yeah, right. So everything Glenn Barry was saying to you was falsehood.
Yeah, and that guy had been very, very good to me after my accident to ask me to become his partner and everything. And at some point, he sold his boat, I remember, and he asked me to go get him an ounce of cocaine in Vancouver. And since I was a user, I knew where to get dope, and I brought him back an ounce of cocaine. And he started selling some. And this is when, after that, he left for Colombia, apparently. He left for Colombia. And he let me the old bag of cocaine, and I told him, don't do that. And he did. And by the time that he came back, I had gone through everything. And he says, I made you a favor, and now it's your turn to make me a favor. And I didn't know at the time, when he came back from Colombia, he had told his friend a lot about me. And these guys were over there without me knowing it. Glenn Barry took me over there. And on the way over there, he told me that he had told his friends that I had taken back like 100 grams of heroin from Thailand. I never brought back heroin from Thailand at the time. That was from Nepal, number one. And he told them a whole bunch untrue, but he didn't want to lose face. And then he got really upset at me. Don't make me lose face before my friend. I help you out. Now it's your turn to do me the favor, to return me the favor. On the scale, like I said, I was targeted, the 1A target as a major heroin trafficker and importer. There's nothing higher than that. And the RCMP, based on those information, asked the RCMP headquarters to undergo what they call a major RCMP operation, which usually is only meant to target members of the mob, criminal gang, Asian gang, whoever you name it. I mean, but not simple citizen like me. I was only a junkie. I was nothing else. But
and I think that's what's
surely they were sure that I was that other person.
Given the record that they pulled up and said was yours, but it was not yours, was that record enough to launch a major undercover operation? Would that have been enough? You're saying that it should only be for major criminal organizations. This person had 11 convictions. Yeah. Does that constitute enough to launch an operation?
In that case, because I'm aware of all the criminal charges against that person, it doesn't.
Okay, so even they definitely had no right to launch an investigation against you because you had no criminal record. You were just a user and you didn't even have any drug convictions at this time, correct?
And for the purposes of what the entire operation was about, even if you were that guy, it wouldn't
be justified.
No, that's what I was going to say. It's you did not have any criminal record at that time, correct? Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. You had no record, so they never should have launched anything against you specifically. But even with the mistaken identity, the record that they mistakenly linked to you was not enough to justify launching an investigation.
Not a major operation like this.
And yet they did anyways.
They did because they made the RCMP headquarters believe in Ottawa that they had fallen on someone big that was worth, investing money to take down. And they use Canada have a drug policies that it says for the RCMP that they always have to go to the highest echelon of the criminal organization. I had no organization, but they made the RCMP headquarters believe that I was heading a criminal organization in Thailand and Canada, and that I was supplying heroin even in Australia. We'll talk more about this later on when we get there. But it's just incredible what they made the RCMP headquarters believe. Everything was based on the information given by Glenn Barry. And when I met them on the beach during the sea cavalcade, after Glenn Barry got upset after me, as we were on our way over there, and he told me that his friends were to be there, I told him, I don't have to meet your friends. We're not living in the same world. I'm fishing salmon, and planting trees and working on construction. I'm not dealing containers of cocaine. I'm not dealing anything, in fact.
And this is where it's so unbelievable that, you know, Glenn Barry didn't even believe that you were the guy who, you know, I guess he just hoped that you'd be able to do what they were going to ask you to do. And he was able to convince them. They were somehow able to convince the entire department.
Water, yeah, exactly.
That you were somehow some, you know, a grand poobah of heroin trafficking.
Yeah, not heroin trafficking and even cocaine, because in the document, it said that I had contact all over Asia and Colombia. I've never been in Colombia, so I don't know how it got there. And
okay, so head office gives the okay to initiate this investigation.
Yeah, but before they give the authorization, after I met them on over Robert Street during the sea cavalcade, and that they talked to me, they said, well, just listen to Glenn, he will have a lot to tell you about. And a week later, Barry Bennett came over Gibson's Landing.
So who is Barry Bennett?
Barry Bennett was RCMP surgeon at the RCMP division in Vancouver. He's the one who was Glenn Barry's handler as a civil agent.
Okay.
He was handling Glenn Barry, and he's the one who started this whole mess. Because I think, like I told Victor Manarek afterward, these guys wanted to make a name for themselves. And the opportunity to go to Thailand, to the Golden Triangle, they thought would give them that opportunity. And once they come back here, they would be treated as heroes. By Saturday night, Glenn Barry was on the phone when I got to the office at the marina, and he was talking with Bennett, who apparently was in Chimanis. And he was telling Bennett on the phone, did you dig a hole in the guy to make sure that he will sink at the bottom of the Georgia Strait? And I was next to him. Then he started laughing. I thought it was a joke at first, so I didn't make anything of it. And by Sunday morning, when the boat came back to the marina, I went on the dock to grab the boat to tie it up. And as I was doing that, I looked inside the boat, and there was only Barry Bennett inside. The other tall guy was missing. And
what made you? Was it because of that phone call that you heard that planted the idea for you, or the notion that something bad had happened on that boat?
It's the phone call the day before was one thing, but when Barry Bennett walked out of the boat and he bumped into me, like I say at the beginning of my book, he was looking at me with cold eyes. I mean, it just freeze my blood. And when I turned towards the boat and looked inside the boat, I started seeing splatters of blood inside the boat. And I stepped in and I looked at the bottom, and I saw one empty casing of 9mm on one side, and then a second one on the other side. Then I grabbed both casings and I went up to see Glenn Barry and I asked him what it is. What's going on here? We're running a business. And I showed him the casing. I had both of them in my hand. And he pushed me back. He said, you don't say a word about it, otherwise the same thing will happen to you. I had become accessory to murder. I even had manipulated empty casings on the boat that may have been bullets that were used to kill the other guy.
Did you think that, or did anyone say that to you? Did Glenn Barry say that?
No. I did think when I saw that and I showed it to him, then he said that I was involved in this, that I wanted or not. When I look at the casing, it said just manipulated.
So are you afraid? Are you confused?
I'm afraid. Yeah, I'm afraid. I had all the reasons to freak out. I was only a normal citizen. I wasn't like that other guy that I was mistaken for. I was peace and love, playing music and planting trees. That's all I was doing.
So are you thinking of an escape plan now? Are you thinking, how can I get out of this? What do I do? Did you ever think of going to the police about this?
The first thing Glenn Barry told me after that, he said, if you say any word about this, the same thing will happen to you. We're going to kill you. There was no way for me to go to the RCMP. And in fact, even if I had done that, some other citizen in Gibson that filed complaints against Glenberry at the RCMP after that, and the RCMP never answered any of the complaint, including Mr. Jardine, who was Glenberry to warn him that he was to blow up his boat. I mean, stuff like that. And the RCMP never took a moment to look at these complaints. So I knew that I was caught in a place that I had to work my way out one way or another. But when someone made it clear that whatever I do, they're going to find me. Wherever I go, they're going to find me.
Why do you feel this way? What gave you the indication that they would track you down and find you?
But Glenberry told me. Glenberry told me, he says, wherever you will be going, we will always find a way to find you. And it's only by mid-August that September, this is when they got the authorization from a headquarters to run a major operation, because Barry Bennett and his team went on to tell our CMP headquarters that they had the guy that they wanted for that could lead them to the Golden Triangle, northern Thailand.
And when was the first time you were specifically instructed to do something?
Right after the murders. Actually, they asked me to go to Thailand for them. Glenberry asked me several times. Between the time I met Barry Bennett and the murder scenario, Glenberry asked me many times if I would like to make money. Would you like to make money, Jetson? And we will send you over there. All you have to do is to introduce my friend to the person you're dealing with. I said, I'm not dealing with anybody over there. I never bought any heroin back from Thailand. And the only heroin I bought in Thailand was from tuk-tuk drivers. And this is what I told them the first night I met them, that the only people I knew over there were tuk-tuk drivers. And I remember Dennis Massey started laughing, and Barry Bennett also kind of slapped me on the shoulder. So Glenn told us that it wouldn't be easy to talk to, that he wouldn't tell us everything. He says, we like people like that, people who don't talk.
So they made a decision about you and who you were, and they weren't listening really to what you were actually saying. They figured you were just somebody who was tight-lipped.
Yeah, this is what they thought. And they firmly believe I could lead them northern Thailand. This is, it's unfortunate that they believe that. Myself, from my point of view, I just cannot comprehend this even up to these days, over 30 years after. Because, why would you want to take a normal citizen, a junkie on top of that, and to bring him to his death sentence in another country in order to get to the Golden Triangle and whoever they were after? Did they believe that they were to shut down a pipeline of heroin? Even if you shut down one pipeline, even 10 kilos, in Thailand, in fact, 10 kilos is like dust. It's like a pebble on the beach. It's nothing more. They were producing 450 tons of heroin back then. We're talking about 4,500 tons of opium, because it takes 10 kilos of opium to do 1 kilo of white heroin number 4 like they have in Thailand. And
which, this is what's extraordinary. With all of that going on, they couldn't find anyone other than you.
And even through Operation Deception, that was called Deception, actually, ironically.
Apropos?
Yeah, and the biggest thing they caught in this whole operation was like half kilo of cocaine from one guy, and the other guys were 1 gram, 2 grams. Glenberry even got his brother-in-law busted, Michael Willihan, for 4 ounces of pot. And Willihan won his case before the BC Supreme Court on the ground of entrapment. The court decided that the RCMP were not allowed to entrap Michael Willihan the way they did, the way Glenberry did.
There's this murder scene. You think you are now an accomplice to a murder scene on a boat.
Mm-hmm.
And so then how does your story continue from there? You're feeling trapped. You're feeling like you have nowhere to go, like you have nothing to do. You're trying to move on. And somehow, like we had said at the start of the episode, you end up in another country as part of this undercover operation. So what's the missing link there? How do you go from seeing something on a boat and then getting flown across to the other side of the world?
They were after me from September 1987 right up to February 1989. So it's like a year.
And this was all part of their undercover operation.
Just like in Mr. Big cases, that they will spend weeks and months on someone to make him believe that he's part of a criminal organization, that he wanted or not, doesn't really matter at that point. By early May 1988, that Dennis Massey guy that I had met with Barry Bennett, the first meeting we ever had, wanted to press me a lot to go to Thailand and to make it quick. I didn't have any money. I didn't even have a passport. My passport was retained by the Canadian government because I had the debt with the British consulate in Nepal, who had lent me £500 to come back here, to come back home. And Glenn Barry, at that point, I told him that I couldn't take all that pressure from Dennis Massey. A few days later, he says, don't worry about Dennis Massey because Barry Bennett's going to kill him. You're going to see him today, and just do as I say and everything will be fine. So I met Massey on May 3rd, 88, and he started again to tell me that you have to go. And Glenn Barry came back home after that. He was parked right by the house on West 23rd Avenue in Vancouver, and he was waiting for me, and he was pumping up. He was really pumping up, and he told me, he says, by the way, Dennis Massey, it's decided, we talked to our new boss, the Fat Man, and it's decided that Dennis Massey will be killed. Just meet him tomorrow for the last, and it will be the last time. And it was actually the last time I ever saw Dennis Massey. He disappeared from the scene. But after the murder scenario, it led me to go back to Chinatown in Vancouver, and I went to see the Candyman over there. And I just started doing heroin again. Every time, as soon as I had my paycheck, even when I was working in Egmont, I was making good money. I would take an afternoon over the weekend and I would go buy heroin just because it helped me to escape reality.
Yeah.
The same way as it did when I got into prison.
Yeah.
I mean, in prison, we had so much heroin inside the prison. I mean, I was using heroin to escape the reality that was brought upon me at that point. It was the same thing at the time after the murder scenario until my departure to Thailand, when Bennett bought my plane ticket and everything. I didn't have the money to fly from Montreal to Vancouver. And at that point, I said, I don't have the money to fly to Vancouver. And he got very, very upset at me. And Glenn Barry called me right after that. He said, if you don't jump on a plane, we're going to go get you in Vancouver, and we're going to go after your family too. When I got arrested, according to my brother, the RCMP, not the RCMP, they don't know who it was, but some people went home with kaggle, with a hood on their face and everything, and they scared my family. And some people called my family to tell them the reason. They even told my family that I had AIDS, that I would die. And none of this was true. I never found out who did that. But who would have reason to go on the balcony at my dad and mom and knock on the door and scare the shit out of them?
Were they doing it just to scare them? Were they asking them for money?
But someone told my family that I owe them a lot of money and they would have to pay.
So was that the breaking point for you when they started threatening your family? Is that when you said, okay, fine, I'll just do whatever you want me to do?
Until I left to Thailand, my family had not been threatened. It's only when I got arrested that someone went over my family in Drummondville and told them that I owed them money that they would have to pay. I don't know if it was meant to turn my family against me. I don't have any evidence of that.
So again, just
be a reason to make sure that no one helped me over there in Thailand while I'm in prison. Introduce them to a source of heroin in Thailand. As a reward, they were giving me 10% of all the amount of heroin, whichever amount they were to take back to Canada. They wanted to purchase 10 kilos at first, which meant 1 kilo of heroin for me delivered at home because they had the cleaning crew, they had the plane pilot to take it on the plane, cleaning crew in Vancouver to take the air in out of the airplane, and someone would have just delivered that on my doorstep because I moved to Quebec in October of '88, and they came all the way over Magog where I was living to pass me a message that I was better to get moving, better get ready to go over there because the fat man was getting impatient. I had not met the fat man yet. I had only heard about him, and everything I heard made me believe that it wasn't the type of guy I wanted to meet at all. And when I met him, and actually in January, when I saw the fat man, that guy was thick like, a refrigerator. And I was maybe 125 pounds at that point. And he promised me, just like Dennis Massey had done in the past, he promised me 10% of the earnings they were to purchase over there. They paid for my plane ticket and everything. And when we got over there at long last in February, I introduced them because myself, the only thing I did over there, I went to Chiang Mai with the picture and the map. And I went to the Porn Hotel in Chiang Mai to find a guy whose nickname was Porn. He was a rickshaw driver, and he was sleeping in his rickshaw when I got there. That guy was a father of 3 kids. He was earning maybe 100 baht a day, which is $5, to peddle people on his rickshaw around Chiang Mai. This is how he was living. And he used to sell a gram here and there to tourists who wanted to get high. That's all it was. And then when I met that guy and I told him these guys wanted to have 5 to 10 kilos, so perhaps my sister can help you. And he took me over his sisters. But when I got there, their sister was living in a slum on the outskirts of Chiang Mai. I mean, we're not talking about the triads we're not talking about anyone running in the high sphere of drug dealing. That lady was a hairdresser, actually. She was cutting hair to earn a living to feed her own kids.
Yeah.
And I finally introduced Barry Bennett and Derek Flanagan, Corporal Derek Flanagan, to her when we were in Chiang Mai. And when we were in the slum, I was with Flanagan and Bennett. And at some point, when we were talking with her, a young kid walked in the house and he whispered something in her ear. And she looked at me and she said, "No, will you come here, please?" And when I went to talk to her, she told me that my friends were cops. I said, "They cannot be cops. These guys are killing people for a living," I told her. So she refused to deal with them. So from the start, the source that they were after in all their records here on file at E-Division in Ottawa was about that hairdresser in Chiang Mai. But she refused to deal with them.
Do you ever look back at that moment when she said they were cops? Do you ever look back and think, could I have believed her? Could I have seen it?
It was like any operation, Mr. Big operation, although it wasn't called that at that time. I mean, they have ways and means to make you believe. And in my head, I could see still the casing in my hand, the blood on the boat, Glenn Barry threatening me, and Dennis Massey would disappear also, which I was told that he had been killed as well. I mean, and how many others had been killed, I don't know, because Glenn Barry was telling me that Bennett was their enforcer. He's the one who was doing the dirty work for them. Actually, I mean, when you're sure that people had been killed, you don't have any reason, even on the ground, that this girl told you that these guys are cops. Okay, in my mind, okay, can they be cops? They kill people. They cannot be cops.
Yeah.
Can we look at this another way? So there's the whole, they're murderers. They kill people. They've, tracked me down across the country. They threaten me. They threaten my family. Like, there's all that coercive side of it.
Police would do that.
But the other side of it is they're offering you a kilo of heroin. Yeah. They're flying you halfway across the world.
Big offers.
So did it ever cross your mind that this seems too good to be true? Right? Because the old saying is, if it seems too good to be true, it usually is.
It might have been so, Kelly, but on the other hand, at some point, I had enough. I wanted to get it over with.
Right.
And
So there was never any point either from the coercion side or from the
and I was a drug addict.
bribery side that you thought this can't be real. There's no way this can be real.
When you're hooked on heroin and someone proposed you to give you such amount of heroin, it's pretty hard not to believe it. Even more so when you have guys like Glenn Barry who's been dealing dope in Gibson's, and you're sure that his friends are dope dealers because they bought drugs from other people I knew in Vancouver. I mean, it's not only one thing that convinced me that I didn't have choice to go. I mean, I knew after 18 months that I was sure that they were drug dealers. I was sure that they were killers also.
You're sure that they could end your life at any time.
They could end my life, exactly. And if I happen to disappear, if I want to go to get away, they will go after my family. That was probably one of the major points. When Glenn Barry told me we will go after your family if you're trying to get away from us, that pretty much did it for me. I met the RCMP members on the Thursday, and that was Thursday. We're on the 15th of February, and after that, the day after, we went to meet Porn's sister, and the deal fell off. And the day after, Porn came back and with a couple other sources, but it didn't work out. And we were in the room at the hotel on Sunday morning, and they were about to wrap everything up. And Bennett told me there's going to be some unhappy people back home if this thing doesn't work out. And it's on recording, it's proven, and I mean, it's there, it's his voice. And Doc turned around, the fat man, and he says, yes, we've been waiting a long time for this, Alan, and for me, it was like the kiss of death. So luckily in one way and luckily not, would it perhaps have been better if Porn would have just faded away, but Porn came back and announced that he had found another source. And on Sunday night, these two Thai girls came by the hotel, and they were ready to do the deal, but only on one conditions, that it would take place over a parking lot about 2 blocks away from the RCMP where they were living at the Chiang Mai Orchid Hotel. Because Doc wanted absolutely to do the deal in the public place. But all the ties that they had met so far, including Porn sisters plus 2 other sources the day after that refused to deal with that, Doc wanted to do the deal in the public place, and there was no way the Thais would do that in Chiang Mai, and no one would tell them what to do on their own ground. So, yes, they were upset. A lot of money had been invested by the RCMP. Oh, shoot, I don't know they were RCMP yet, but I just tried to put myself in the head of the fat man and his group. There were 4 guys who came to Thailand. There were plane tickets had been paid, hotels, and 18 months that they've been after me. Sure, these guys wanted to get the deal done, and at that point, it didn't make any difference who would sell them heroin. Anyone would want to sell them heroin, they would agree to deal with them. So it had nothing to do to say that we want to take down a pipeline of heroin in Thailand, because the so-called pipeline, refused to deal with them on Porn's sister, and she wasn't even a pipeline. Right. And actually, they ended up doing the deal with the 2 Thai ladies. And I proposed to Dot, I said, listen, that girl Nipa is ready to do the deal 2 blocks away from here. She will sell you 2 kilos at first, and if everything is fine, she will bring you another 3 right afterward. And he agreed to that, and he sent Flanagan with me to go look at the parking lot over there, a couple blocks away from the hotel, and Flanagan agreed the place fit what they wanted, and that was a good setup for them. So I returned to the hotel while Flanagan stayed in the parking lot with Nipa's sister. He remained there, and there was another Thai guy on a scooter, their brother, who had the heroin with him, so he wanted to keep an eye on that. So I went back to the hotel to tell Bennett to take the money over. She wanted $14,000 a kilo, which was $28,000 US. So the fat man agreed, and at that point, Bennett and Jim Girdlestone, who was their so-called plane pilot, who had been introduced to me by accident the day before, decided to come over the parking lot with a little duffel bag filled with money. And when we got to the parking lot, he jumped back in the truck, in her little pickup truck, and drove next to the theater to tell them, hey, follow me, we just want to do the deal over there. And just before that, I had told Bennett, you don't need me to do the deal now, you can deal with her. And he says, no, you're coming with us because you are insurance policy, that everything will work fine. And they took me with them to make sure that I would be there present upon their transaction. And as we went next to the theater, there was a back alley there with the lamppost a little further. She went to park her little pickup truck there, and me and Flanagan walked back to Bennett and Girdlestone, who were a couple blocks. That's about a couple blocks away from where she parked it up. And
could
Bennett,
you see them?
Eh?
Could you see them?
Not from there. We had to walk about a block, and after that we could see the tail light, not the tail light, but the front light of the pickup truck under the lamppost. And we were, it was getting very dark out there. It was like 8:30. And Bennett agreed to follow Flanagan and Nipa and me to the truck to do the transaction. And he told Girdlestone to stay there. He was by a phone booth near the theater. And as we started to get there, I could see Flanagan, who was looking for that Thai guy who had there, but he couldn't see him because he was back to a big fence with a lot of plants and everything, and he was just melting in there and waiting for Nipa's order to come out with the air. And then at that point, Bennett opened the door on the passenger side, which is on the left side over there, because they're driving on the different side in here.
The opposite side, yeah.
Yeah, and the opposite side. And I stood next to Bennett while he had his buddy inside the pickup truck. And he asked Nipa, where's the drug? She wanted to see the money first. Bennett says, no, we want to see the drug first. And the exchange was there like this, and I was standing right next to the door by the bumper, the left bumper in the wheel, and Bennett was there and talking with her. So at some point, Nipa called her brother to come out of his hiding spot, and he walked a couple steps, and after that, he jumped at the back in the cargo area of the pickup truck. And at that point, Flanagan was just looking at him, going, and Bennett at some point asked him, does he have the drug? He says, have you seen the drug? He says, not yet. So at some point, Nipa, she wanted to see the money, absolutely. She asked him, show me the money. So Bennett opened the duffel bag, and she realized that the old bundle of money had been wrapped up with duct tape, so you couldn't see the money. And I told Bennett, stop screwing around. When I told him to show her the money, this is when he showed it to her as well. And when I saw that, I told him to F in few words, and I started walking backwards. And at that point, Bennett asked again, have you seen the dope? And Flanagan said, yes, he's got it. And he walked Flanagan was a big guy. He made a couple steps, and he just jumped in the cargo area and tackled the Thai guy to the floor and started fighting with him. But the Thai guy was an ex-Muay Thai boxer, so he was able to defend himself pretty much. And that, even if Flanagan was bigger, and a real fight broke out at the back, and Nipa jumped out of the truck and climbed inside the cargo area and jumped on Flanagan's back to try to get him off her brother. At that point, Bennett saw that, and he jumped in the cargo area as well. And as the fight was going on at the back of the truck, Nipa's little sister was standing next to the truck, climbed behind the wheel, and took off while the fight was going on at the back. And myself, I was still walking backward. And at some point, I turned around and started running. And as I got about, I don't know, maybe 150 feet from where the truck was parked, I saw Girdlestone turning the corner at the same time as I did, and he tackled me down the ditch. He was coming like a greyhound, about 60 kilometers an hour, and he tackled me. That guy was over 250 pounds. And
so were you running in the direction of the truck, and was the truck moving with the fight going on?
I was running towards where we came back, where Girdlestone actually was at the phone booth. Myself, I was trying to get away from the scene first. It was dark everywhere except where we had the lamppost and the truck. And Girdlestone tackled me down the ditch. And as we look up, and he said, "I got you now, motherfucker." And I told him, you don't have anything. And as I finished to tell him this, I could see the tail light of the truck down the back alley, and it was completely dark. And we could see the tail light, and we could see when Nipa's sister pushed on the brake at the same time as we heard a gunshot. We heard bang in the back alley. And I mean, at night, the sound travels a lot. There was no noise besides that. And Girdlestone looked at me, "Who's got a gun? Where is your gun?" And I told him no one had a gun. No one. And he says, "I don't believe you." And he started dragging me towards first, when he pulled me up, he started screaming for the Thai police for their backup. There was no one on the scene. The Thais were not there. And I found out later on it was because Flanagan's microphone didn't work out. That's why they couldn't have the signal that the transaction was going on. And at that point, Girdlestone was screaming and screaming, and 2 Thai police came out running. They were plainclothes. And one of them, as he tried to put the handcuffs on me, and I started looking around. I said, "Geez, these guys, they might shot me here." I started running away. I got free, and I started running away. And Girdlestone looked at the Thai police. "Shoot him, shoot him," and start shouting at the Thai to shoot me. It's all proven before the court. It's all in documents. And I turned around like this, and I saw the Thai police aiming this .357 Browning, silver Browning, towards me. So I dove to the ground. Perhaps maybe over a minute and a half, maybe 2 minutes had gone by since we had heard the gunshot. And as soon as the gunshot was heard, we saw, like I said, the brake light for an instant. And the time we blinked our eyes, the truck moved on and disappeared. And Girdlestone came back to pick me up on the ground, and he made sure the handcuff would be put on me properly, and he did so himself with the help of the Thai guys. And they dragged me back where the truck was parked at first under the lamppost, and just pushed me to the ground. And Girdlestone wanted to know what was going on because he knew Bennett and Flanagan were at the back of the truck. We had heard a gunshot. And as he started running in the back alley, as the Thais were holding me to the ground, Bennett walked out from the darkness, and he was holding on to Nipa with his right hand and what could have been a gun in his left hand, but I'm not sure. Even here in court, I couldn't talk about it because, but after that, things got more precise with the Thais, but I wasn't able to talk about it before the court because it was hearsay. Nevertheless, we're going to keep going. I saw Bennett coming, and he was holding on to Nipa, and he just knocked her to the ground next to me and put handcuffs on her, and he started running towards where Girdlestone had run. Towards where the truck had been at the time of the gunshot. And at that point, 2 Thai police took me and dragged me to a police car where they threw me at the back and brought me to the police station.
At what point did you realize that these gangsters were cops?
When I heard not Glenberry, but Derek Flanagan and Bennett shouting, "Police, police, police."
When was that? So before you started running?
Right at the time that Flanagan confirmed to Bennett that the Thai guy had the drug. After that, Barry Bennett started shouting, "Police."
This is right before they all start jumping on each other in the back of the truck.
And After
at that point, because you started to run after that, because you're moving backwards, they're fighting in the back of the truck. What's going on in your mind? Are you like, what the is happening?
Several questions went through my mind, but I was like paralyzed. I was trying to move. You know what? When you're dreaming and you're trying to run, everything seemed to go in slow motion.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I felt. And when I saw Girl Stone coming around the corner and running like a greyhound, I mean, I started waking up a little more. I had chance to run away. I mean, even in the back alley where the truck was parked, I could have run in that direction, but there was nobody there. But I ended up running the other way and ended up in Girl Stone's hand in any case. And when I got arrested, all I had in my pocket was $5. This is the only money I had in Thailand, because they were the one who were giving me money every day to make sure I had something to eat and for my drug and for my guest house. And if the deal wasn't going down as they wanted, they were to cut me the money. So that's why I didn't have any money. I didn't even have money to pay my bus ticket to go down to Bangkok and to pay my tax to get out of the country. And they made everyone believe that I was some kind of Pablo Escobar.
And what are you fighting for at this point?
Fighting for the truth. I'm fighting for your kids, for the right of your kids to have their rights being respected by the court. I'm fighting for a whole new generation that deserves to have the truth, that deserves to have a fair and just treatment before the court and not to be exposed. I mean, to go before judges who don't care about the truth. That's why I'm fighting. Yeah. And maybe more reason. Because it's not only about me, and like I said, it's about you, it's about your kids, it's about a whole country here that deserve the truth, and not to have judges that will simply do the bidding of the Canadian government.
Well, I don't see Mr. Big Stings going anywhere anytime soon, but that doesn't necessarily mean we have to accept the status quo. I think there's always something that can be done. Like, we can start by re-examining or at least reconsidering what would shock the community conscience. I mean, seriously, this is such an overly broad standard that it doesn't really mean anything. And let's be honest, the standard really boils down to what would shock the judge. I don't think there are many people who would listen to the details of Mr. Big Sting and then say they aren't shocked or even disgusted by the tactics used by the police. We should also avoid using the technique with juveniles or other vulnerable populations. We need to recognize how dangerous the effects of these tactics can be, which again goes back to shocking the community conscience. And maybe most importantly, we should only use Mr. Big Stings in cases where there's other evidence linking the suspect to the crime. We shouldn't just be going on fishing expeditions with the hope of catching a confession in cases that have gone cold.
All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their entrances and exits, and then sometimes they become the target of a sting operation. And you know what they say, there are no small roles. Only key players like Mr. Big, who sets you up for your big line, the confession line, and you deliver. Trouble is, you didn't mean it. The play has fooled you too. The costumes come off, and now all the world's a jail cell. The world of wrongful convictions is a living hell for individuals who end up in it. And believe it or not, it could happen to anyone. Know the law, know how to look for flaws in the system, understand how marginalization works, and most of all, talk about it. Thanks for joining us. I'm Kelly Fanson.
And I'm Kelly Loza.
We'd like to thank our guests for their insight, stories, and expertise. And we'd like to thank you, our listeners, for your interest in the world of wrongful convictions and for sharing our podcast. For more information on wrongful convictions, visit our website at reallifewrongs.com and email us at hello@reallifewrongs.com. You can find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and anywhere you find podcasts.
Real Life Wrongs is produced by Kelly Fanson, edited by Alex Clutch. Promotional materials by Jamie Norrie.
All of us could falsely confess to something.
They blew it all out of proportion, and they got away with it.
Even a country like Canada has people who are charged and convicted of crimes they didn't commit.
There's innocent people who are going to die in prison.
I can't get back the time that they took from me.
And I was just left wondering, like, what the hell is happening?
I knew my life was over right there. That's when my life ended.
They're changing the story that I told them to match to what really happened.
I was just incarcerated for 37 years for somebody else's crime.
That what happened to me could easily happen